Hi everyone, and welcome to Trustful Clinical Budgeting Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra, and today we have a special guest joining us, Kaius Heinila, a seasoned professional in clinical research with over 15 years of experience. Kaius started his career as a CRO and has grown through multiple operational and leadership roles, eventually becoming Chief Commercial Officer at Crown CRO and later taking on strategic decisions, business development and client management roles at Optima Farm and also Aurelia. Before we dive in, Kaius, I would love to give our listeners a quick introduction about yourself, your journey in clinical research, the roles that you have held, and what are the most passionate about in this industry.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra, and thanks for having me. Yeah, like you mentioned, I started my career as a CRA straight out of university back in 2007 for and at that point fairly small CRO in Finland. I progressed through various ClinOps roles, and in the first 10 or so years, I was mostly outsourced actually to big pharma companies, leading monitoring teams in global studies within women's health and cardiology, and also acting as a liaison between the pharma company and their strategic CRO partner. But I was always also interested in the business development side of things. Gradually drifted more to the BD side at my CRO, and then eventually took over leading the commercial activities in 2020. And then when we were acquired by another CRO in 2021, I took over overseeing the partnerships with other CROs. And now most recently, I joined the BD team at Aurelia with a mission to grow and expand the business. I enjoyed working in ClinOps, and it really helped me grow my understanding of the business and how the different teams in clinical studies work together. But being able to be part of the discussions with the sponsors from the very start is probably what I enjoy the most. It's such a broad field, and although each sponsor follows kind of similar regulatory pathways, working with sponsors that are solving issues in so many and so different therapeutic areas is really amazing and inspiring. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me to hear what kind of potential solutions to problems our sponsors are working towards. So I guess that's what I'm most passionate about.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kaius. That's really a great overview. And to kick things off, I would love to explore your perspective on the broader industry trends. So, Kaius, since you also just mentioned that you started your career as a CRA and have grown into leadership roles, including like Chief Commercial Officer in business development and CRO partnerships, has the relationship between sponsors and CROs evolved over the last, let's say, 15 and 20 years? What do you think?
Well, I think over the last 15 to 20 years, the relationships between sponsors and CROs has shifted more from a transactional service-based model to a more integrated and strategic partnership. In the beginning of my career, I think CROs were mainly seen as outsourced capacity, and of course that's still the case for many projects. So sponsors would typically keep most strategic decisions in-house and contract CROs for specific operational tasks like monitoring, data management, or running individual studies. And the relationship was often project by project, very cost driven, and focused more on execution rather than collaboration. But things have changed over time. Firstly, drug development has become much more complex. So we're seeing more advanced therapies, global trials, precision medicine, and increasingly sophisticated regulatory requirements. Sponsors, especially biotech companies, often don't have the full internal infrastructure to manage all of that themselves. And another big shift is the rise, I think, of long-term strategic partnerships and preferred provider models. So instead of sourcing every trial separately, sponsors increasingly work with a smaller group of CRO partners that understand their portfolio, their specific therapeutic areas, and also their internal processes. And that really allows both sides to operate more efficiently and also to share risk.
Okay, because do you think that maybe some CROs now they are seen more as like strategic partners rather than just service providers?
Yeah, definitely. I think every sponsor working with CROs can see the value in having strategic partners and really aim to build and maintain these kind of relationships. I mean, significant efforts are made to set up governance structures to ensure that the partnerships are as smooth and effective as possible, while also, of course, being financially beneficial for both parties.
Okay, I see now. It's clear that, the industry has evolved a lot. And now I would love to dive a bit deeper into our operational side. So, Kaius, having worked both like in trial operations and also commercial roles, you have likely seen that the gap that sometimes exists between what is proposed in the proposals and what actually happens during the trial execution. So, what do the biggest disconnects still exist today, based on your opinion?
I think the biggest disconnects usually happen very early in the process. Many sponsors, especially smaller biotech companies, may not have run multiple clinical trials before. They have very strong scientific expertise, but they may not always have the operational experience needed to fully define what a study will require from an execution perspective. So that can then create a situation where the initial request for proposal is not completely aligned with what the study actually needs operationally. At the same time, the sponsor may not always have the internal resources to critically review every element of a proposal and to assess whether something's missing or in fact something is included that may not be necessary. So the disconnect isn't usually about intent. It's often about experience and clarity at the beginning of the process. And that's where I think CROs have an important responsibility. We shouldn't just respond to what the sponsor asks for. We should act as advisors and educators. That means helping the sponsors refine the scope, challenging maybe their assumptions, and making sure the proposal truly reflects what will be required to run the study successfully.
Mm-hmm.
Transparency is also very important. Being very clear about what's included in the proposal, what assumptions were made, and what's outside of the scope helps prevent misunderstandings later during the study execution. So, in my experience, when both sides invest more time up front to align on the actual operational needs of the trial, many of those execution gaps can then be avoided later on.
So, do you assume that maybe these disconnects they are more on the sponsor and also CRO sides, or maybe like together on the both?
I think it can be both. For example, a smaller sponsor, inexperienced with clinical trials, that doesn't know exactly what it is they need, but also if a CRO takes the specifications and assumptions given to them in an RFP without critically reviewing and considering if it matches what the trial wants to achieve, and if it's actually achievable with the current plan. It can also be a budgetary disconnect. Sponsors may not have an idea how much it's going to cost them to run the trial, and then when they receive proposals from CROs, they realize they don't have the funds to do it. So quite often we actually provide ballpark budgets for smaller biotechs or startups to support them when they're gathering funds. Now, we know it's not going to turn into a project in the very near future, but down the line, they might remember we helped them out and come back to us when it's time to run the study. And then we know they already have a fairly good understanding of what it takes and how much it costs to run their trial.
Okay, so those insights really they highlight the importance of aligning expectations early. Speaking of alignment, budgeting seems to be one of the most challenging areas, and also like you told, I believe that budget planning remains one of the most complex parts of starting a clinical trial. And Kaius, from your experience working with also both sides, like with sponsors and with CROs, what are the most common mistakes made during the budgeting and also feasibility phase?
Yeah, I mean, Budget planning is definitely one of the most challenging parts of starting a clinical trial, and I'd say there's a few common pitfalls. Firstly, focusing too heavily on driving the total cost down while still expecting the same level of quality, timelines, and service. I mean, clinical trials are complex, and if budgets are pushed too aggressively, something usually has to give, whether that's timelines, resources, or flexibility during the trial. Another challenge is that CRO budgets are not always very easy to compare. Different CROs structure their proposals differently, and the level of detail can vary quite significantly. So one CRO might present a monitoring visit as one task in the budget, while another splits it into for preparation, on-site time, follow-up, and report writing. That means that two budgets that look very different on paper might actually represent very similar scopes, or the opposite. So it's important for sponsors to spend time reviewing proposals carefully and discussing assumptions to really understand what's included. And I also often recommend that sponsors don't focus too much on, individual hourly rates or the number of hours per task, because those numbers can vary between organizations depending on internal models and processes. What's usually more meaningful is whether the overall cost for each activity or deliverable makes sense and aligns with the expected scope of work. And then another really important aspect is the feasibility phase. Feasibility generates a lot of valuable information about site availability, recruitment potential, and timelines. In many cases, that information can significantly change the assumptions behind the study. For example, the number of sites required or the expected recruitment rate. So I usually see budgeting as a kind of two-step process, starting with an initial budget based on the sponsor's assumptions, and then refining that budget once the feasibility data comes in. And that helps make the budget much more realistic. And finally, to run a good feasibility, it really depends on strong local knowledge. So knowing which sites to approach, understanding their real capabilities, and being able to interpret their feedback properly. That local insight can make a huge difference in whether the study plan, and therefore also the budget, is truly realistic.
Okay, Kaius, yeah, I see. And just like as we already discussed, you have built an impressive career across multiple roles in clinical research industry. And as we also several times told, you started from CRA and grown to chief commercial officer and now like strategic business development. What advice would you give to the professionals who want to grow from operational roles into strategic or commercial leadership positions in the industry? Or maybe are there some particular skills or like mindsets that are crucial for this transition? Or maybe looking back, is there something you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Well, the first piece of advice would be to be curious about the bigger picture. When you work in operations, you naturally focus on executing your part of the trial well. But if you want to move into more strategic roles, it's important to understand how your work connects to the broader development strategy, why certain study designs are chosen, how timelines affect the overall program, and how decisions impact the sponsor's business objectives. Second thing would be to really develop strong communication and relationship skills. In operational roles, you're often working with internal teams, but in commercial or strategic roles, you spend much more time interacting with sponsors, partners, senior stakeholders. So being able to explain complex topics clearly and build trust with different stakeholders becomes really, really important. Probably often find yourself out of your comfort zone. And in these situations, I always find it's better to be honest if you're unsure or don't know something, and then you bring on an internal expert to discuss it rather than trying to solve everything yourself. I mean, it's perfectly okay not to know everything, but it's not okay to try and wing it. And the last thing I'd highlight is take opportunities to step out of your core role. That might mean, getting involved in proposal development, feasibility discussions, client meetings, cross-functional projects. Especially a lot of bigger companies often have these kind of short-term assignment programs where you can get to know how different departments function. So those experiences can really help you understand how decisions are made from a broader perspective and expose you to the commercial side of the industry.
Okay. Thanks, Kaius. Those are some really actionable insights for anyone looking to advance in clinical research. And before we finish, I need to highlight that, Kaius, it's been such a pleasure having you on our podcast, and your experience and perspectives on sponsor and CRO partnerships, operational challenges, and also leadership growth are invaluable. So to everyone listening, I hope you found this conversation as insightful as I did. And again, Kaius, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your advice. And thank you everyone for listening today, and